You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Dr. Liz Carlisle, author of the book Lentil Underground, Renegade Farmers and the Future of Food in America. Liz is a country singer, agroecologist, and lecturer in the Thinking Matters program at Stanford and in food systems at UC Berkeley. Welcome to the program, Liz.
Thank you so much, Jill.
You said that your book, Lentil Underground, which I thought was just the best title ever of a book, it's a book-length country song to your home state of Montana. Can you tell our listeners a bit about that and how on your tour through the heartland of America you discovered the story which became your book?
Yeah. So this has been such a wonderful sort of culminating moment for me in my learning journey for the last 10 years or so as a person from an agricultural state, really looking to tell positive stories about rural America and at the same time, I think, try to encourage a change that I see happening towards more sustainable practices, towards green jobs, towards all of these things that I think provide more broad-based benefits from our resource-based economies rather than, these histories of mining and of agricultural systems that were other forms of mining. So, I started off very much as a storyteller, as a country singer. In the course of that work, got really interested in agroecology and the science behind sustainable farming, and also in structural change and the agricultural industry, the policies that shape the way people farm. So went to work for an organic farmer from Montana named John Tester, who'd gotten elected to the U.S. Senate, to try to be part of that change and learn about that change. And met a bunch of incredible farmers from Montana who were converting to organics through more diversified farming systems, and decided, you know what I need to do? I need to go to grad school and, get enough of a background so I can have an intelligent conversation with these people. And then I'm going to do a research project with them. And then, storyteller that I am, what I learned from that research project seemed so compelling to me that I wanted to share it with the rest of the world. And so, drew on those storytelling roots, and hence the book-length country song, Lentil Underground, came out of dissertation research, but is really a story, told as narrative nonfiction.
And for listeners who are intrigued, and maybe a bit perplexed, thinking Lentil Underground, what is the Lentil Underground? What is that?
Yes. Well, so I coined the phrase. I'm glad you think it's apt.
I love it. I'm really now really more impressed than I was when I was reading the book. That's great.
So it's a double metaphor. I'm talking about a group of farmers who shifted from this industrial agricultural paradigm that I suspect many of your users are familiar with, the idea of maximizing yield and maximizing profit, which is not necessarily the farmer's perspective, but is something people are sort of forced into by structural constraints, to this really deep focus on the soil and the idea that instead of sort of farming up, and that the idea was to take resources out of the soil and maximize your yield for this year's crop, that the goal of farming was actually farming down, that you should be regenerating your soil so that it would be there for you, one generation, two generations, hundreds of years down the line. So the Lentil Underground talks about literally underground, what's happening in the soil root zone as people switch to more diversified farming systems and rotate in crops that will replace the fertility that other crops used. But then it's also, of course, about the social underground that's necessary to make a massive change in what was, sort of the core economic practice in this region of industrial agriculture. Obviously, one farmer can't do this by themselves successfully. It took, dozens of farmers banding together to build the infrastructure they needed, to build the knowledge they needed, and also just the moral support to do something really different and, sort of withstand all of the sidelong glances from neighbors.
You answered this question a bit in what you just said, but when Dave Oien, one of the farmers in your book, seeded the first organic lentil in his county, why was this such a radical act?
It sounds like I'm probably over-dramatizing this, right? When you hear this, if you're from an urban place, you're going like, what? Really? Just planting a different plant? But the way your farm looks is such an important thing in a lot of rural communities. It's a very public occupation to be a farmer, and it comes to be almost a moral judgment of someone if their farm is, quote, clean. Which means free of weeds, which means that the aesthetic of the farm, the look of the farm is, what people are expecting. And amber waves of grain is the classical one in much of the middle of the country, certainly in Montana, which is historically a wheat growing region. What you would expect to see is a field of nothing but wheat plants, and ideally pretty tall and with nothing else in there. And there's an aesthetic that's developed around that as the sign of good farming. And it's even become part of, our culture. You hear this in America the Beautiful, amber waves of grain. But of course, ecologically speaking, that's a monoculture lacking in biodiversity. And so it's very vulnerable to everything from climate change to just regular hail and drought. And of course, pests that get used to the wheat and get very comfortable there. So when you plant lentils, you're returning the nitrogen to the soil that the wheat was using up. You are adding biodiversity. You're doing all these great things ecologically speaking, but you're completely disrupting the aesthetic. You have this squatty little plant that looks messy compared to a wheat plant. It does. A wheat plant is all about this sort of tall, thin profile, very sort of phallic and masculine American, right? And a lentil plant, they're kind of not uniform. They're only a couple feet tall. The growth is spotty. There tend to be other plants in the field too. And so neighbors would drive by and say, this farmer is lazy, or this farmer is crazy. Just from what they could see, it looked like somebody was doing a bad job. And it's like letting down the neighborhood kind of thing. It's like in a suburban area, if you saw somebody with dandelions in their lawn, similar thing actually, where, maybe ecologically speaking, that's not a bad deal. But in terms of the aesthetic of the neighborhood, the thought of the neighbors would be, oh, the weed seed's going to spread into our fields and all these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. That makes total sense. So when Dave Oien came back, he left Montana for a while and then came back home. Can you tell us a little bit about his story and how he ended up planting those lentils?
Yeah, so Dave is the central character of this story, and he comes back to his family farm in 1976. He had gone away to college, and he was part of this generation that was really encouraged to leave the farm. Especially his parents had a very small farm by sort of modern standards. According to Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz in the early 70s, you were supposed to get big or get out, plant fence row to fence row. That agriculture was moving towards agribusiness. That was a word that Earl Butz liked to use a lot. And he just didn't see a role for family farmers moving forward. They were really characterized as backward and in the way of American progress. So a 280-acre farm in Montana wasn't considered something that had a future. And so Dave's parents were really excited that he got into University of Chicago and encouraged him, go on, have a professional career, do something else. And so he went to Chicago. He got involved in anti-war movements. This was the late 60s. He got really excited about the ecology movement, started thinking about his role in a globe that would be more peaceful and more sustainable. And then came back to Montana, went to University of Montana for the rest of his degree, read Black Elk Speaks, was exposed to a lot of American Indian philosophy, and basically came back to a land-based philosophy of peace and justice and sustainability. And everybody around him was trying to go back to the land. He's surrounded by these people who are like, where could we find some place to farm and realize all of these ideals we have? And he says to himself, well, I've got 280 acres. So in 1976, he drives back to his parents' farm. He's 27 with this plan to put solar panels on the roof of the farmhouse. This is kind of his big first line in the sand of we're going in a different direction.
And I wonder what the neighbors thought of that.
Yeah, well, they were the first solar panels in the community, so they probably didn't know what they were. But, he convinced his dad with an economic argument. He did a spreadsheet, and he said, here's what we're going to save on our energy bill. So his dad actually got up on the roof with him and helped him put these solar panels on. I never met his father, but sounds like, pretty stoic, practical Norwegian guy. And then, the next step was, we're running the house off of solar energy, but now we need to run the farm off of solar energy. We want to get this farm off of chemicals. And what would that mean? What plants could we use or animals to harvest solar energy so that we have a farm that doesn't run on fossil fuel-based chemicals, fertilizers and herbicides? So that was really the big project, and here he is, 66 years old, still working on that project to move to rotations that don't require any chemicals, and now an organic farmer. But that was quite a process, and he wasn't the only one. He was one of the first, but lots of other people of that generation started coming back to family farms and having these tough conversations with their parents who had put them through college with money that they made from the farm programs, which told them to do this industrial plan, and the kids came home and said, well, thanks for the degree, but I want to change all of this.
So big changes, big transition time there. And so Dave is on the farm. He's talked to his dad. They put up the solar panels. They're starting to plant and wanting to run the whole farm on solar. What was the reception of the community when he did put in the lentil crops, and how did he talk other farmers into joining him?
Well, I think, initially in the late 70s, the reception was, what? There was a little bit of trust because his family had an upstanding, reputation in the community. And so there was a little bit of, well, he's from here. He must not be just a total idiot, even though he went off to Missoula, which was known, it's my hometown, so I can make these jokes, but known as the den of sin and liberalism in rural Montana. But what happened in the 1980s across the grain-growing regions of the country was the farm crisis. So there were 3 really bad drought years all in a row. Fertilizer prices were very high because fossil fuel prices were high and fertilizers based on fossil fuel. Meanwhile, grain prices were very low because of dynamics in global grain markets. So farmers all over the country found themselves facing the choice between making a change and going bankrupt. And so that really changed the reception to ideas like Dave's, because a lot of farmers didn't want to leave their land. They'd been on it for 3 generations, 4 generations, and it was important to them to stay in agriculture for some really deep reasons, spiritual reasons for many people. People said, they would be taking care of their parents, and their parents would say, I want to die on this land. They needed to find a way to make it work. And at that point, Dave had been doing this for 10 years, and he'd started experimenting with things like legumes. So this is where the lentils come in, because they're part of this leguminous family of plants. Any plant in the bean and pea family can do this totally miraculous thing of pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere, fixing it into a plant-available form, working with bacteria in the soil. So they're essentially making their own fertilizer. So this was this key step of there's a plant that we can use to create fertility in the soil rather than having to use a chemical fertilizer. And if we rotate this plant and other plants, we'll have more ecological diversity, and so we won't have these unfilled niches, and so we won't have as many problems with weed invasion, so then we won't have to use the herbicides. And then meanwhile, there's this organic market developing. And so in the late 80s, this is still kind of a niche market, but in the 90s, it really explodes into the mainstream. And so these farmers who had to change because they didn't have any other choice meet this whole group of consumers who want a different choice. And so by the late 90s, this is starting to look like not just a good ecological decision or a good decision for people's health, but a terrific economic decision.
Mm-hmm. So can you share with our listeners some of the benefits of growing lentils and why lentils are such a healthy choice for farmers and consumers? And I'd also love for you to touch on why you describe lentils as the Robin Hood of agriculture. And you spoke about that a bit, but maybe a bit more in depth.
Yes. Well, lentils, obviously, I'm a big fan of because there's this synergy between health for the soil, economic benefit for the farmer, and nutritional benefit for the eater. And, 10,000 years ago at the beginning of agriculture, when lentils were first planted, these were all the same people. I think they evidence the fact that eating and farming should be and are deeply connected, and many of us, thank goodness, are involved in both. So big benefits of lentils. The reason I call them the Robin Hood of agriculture is because they're taking this resource of nitrogen, which is so important, from places where it's really abundant, namely the atmosphere, and distributing it to places where it's needed in the soil. So that's why I call it the Robin Hood of agriculture. So big benefit of lentils for farmers is this fixing nitrogen, providing fertility. In this region, another big benefit was biodiversity because they're being rotated into what used to be grain monocultures. For people, you probably have heard that they're a great source of plant-based lean protein, inexpensive, so have been a staple food for people for 10,000 years for that reason, particularly working people. But then they're also high in micronutrients. So highest natural source of folate, really important for pregnant women, for the development of the embryo. And then they're also 56% higher than blueberries in antioxidant capacity. So that's just a little taste of macro and micronutrients in lentils.
Wow. And I think lentils, their time has come because it's the International Year of Pulses. And lentils are I think more people are aware of them this year.
Yeah. I've done a lot of really fun things with the International Year of Pulses, and I love that it's international because, a fun thing about being the author of this book is that we've done a lot of events with foods, and there are foods from all over the world that incorporate lentils and other pulse crops. They have this long culinary history. So you have dal in India, you have mesarwat in Ethiopia, you have mujadara in Lebanon. So, something that's been incorporated into all these really interesting and deep culinary traditions.
It's cross-cultural. Lentils are amazing. And not only are they healthy for us to eat, but they also, I think they're they tolerate variable climate conditions as well, which could be useful in the future.
Yeah, and that's part of the story of these farmers in Montana. They knew they needed to add a legume to their system to rotate with grain. You see this in traditional agricultural systems all over the world. The challenge was finding one that would fit within their climate because it's just a 100-day growing season. If you've ever gotten snowed out in Montana when you went in late September for a hike or something, you know about this. And it's also semi-arid, 14 to 18 inches of rainfall. So it's challenging to find crop plants that function well in that environment. Not a long enough season for soybeans, for example, which is what is rotated in the American Midwest. So lentils are an incredible solution, and you see them in places like the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, where they come from, Australia, Israel, in these regions where it's difficult to grow a lot of plants. Lentils, being so drought tolerant, being these short little plants that don't need a lot of water or, a major boost of nutrients, they're really well adapted. And absolutely, with climate change, I think they're going to be increasingly important.
And you also don't get the unintended consequences of using those chemical soil amendments, the excess nitrogen running off. And I would see how lentils are a better choice in many ways. And it saves you money as well, I would guess.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, if you're comparing to any other kind of protein, certainly animal protein, it's going to be much cheaper economically and cheaper in terms of the sort of deep economy, to reference Bill McKibben of the resources used. The fact that they cook so quickly is important in a lot of developing countries where you really are thinking about how much cooking fuel are you going to need to use to produce a meal for your family. A split lentil you can cook in 10 minutes. And certainly if you're sort of a busy person in any country, not having to soak them overnight is useful. Although I will say if you soak or sprout lentils, you'll get more of the nutrition out of them. They're more digestible. So if you can remember to soak them the night before, you get a little bit more bang for your buck. But if you don't, at least you can prepare your food, and have a plant-based protein to eat.
You have such an interesting cast of characters in your book of these farmers that planted lentils and joined the Lentil Underground. Do you want to share a couple of stories or a couple of the characters in the book as well as Dave?
Yeah. Gosh, it's just been one of the great pleasures of my life to get to know these folks, and I continue to stay in touch with this group since writing the book. I'm actually going back to their annual growers gathering in Montana in just a couple weeks now. But one story I'll share is a farmer named Jerry Habits. He doesn't live that far away from Dave. He's about 25 miles away and had known of Dave for a long time, sort of watched from afar as he made this crazy transition on his family's farm. And Jerry thought it was just crazy. He had the same thought as a lot of the neighbors is, boy, this farm is really going downhill. But fast forward a few years, that was when Jerry was 19. So fast forward a few years, he's grown up, he's in charge of his own family farm, he's going through the farm crisis, and he's facing bankruptcy. And he's trying to figure out how he can stay on the land. And meanwhile, this lentil business has started up that's marketing these as ecologically appropriate crops. It seems to be doing pretty well. They're asking for more farmers to grow these lentils. And so, he's a little bit skeptical, but he's kind of at last resort stage in the late 90s. He shows up at the lentil plant and asks Dave, can you tell me a little bit more about these lentils? I think I might want to plant them. And he tells this great story about how, first he tried the Bible, then he went to a psychic, and then he went organic. This conventional farmer trying to figure out how to get out of a really tough situation, and now is somebody that people come to learn about organic farming, his other neighbors, and has done all kinds of interesting experiments, a triple intercrop of lentils and chickpeas and buckwheat that happened by accident and worked out, and then, he replicated it. So he's just been a terrific character to get to know, and I think people like Jerry have the ability to be ambassadors because there's lots of conventional farmers who are a little bit skeptical of organics, see it as based in a culture that they don't relate to, but when somebody that they do relate to starts to farm organically and can communicate about it in a way that speaks to their neighbors, that's so incredibly valuable.
I can see that totally. And so Dave and his cohorts, they actually formed a business out of this. And can you tell our listeners about that business?
Yeah, so you can go on the internet and find this business. It's called Timeless Natural Food. You can order lentils direct to your door, and you can find out where they are. I think they're in about 500 natural food stores across the country, and work with restaurants and farm to school and farm to college. But it certainly didn't start out looking as snazzy as all of that. If you look at some of the packaging and stuff on the website, it was for farmers who had planted lentils because they were ecologically appropriate but had no market for them. So if you've been in rural American communities, you see these grain elevators near to the railroad tracks, these big grain bins where farmers take their grain. And so farmers really aren't involved in direct marketing. They never see the consumer. They don't really have much of a choice about what to plant. It's only what they can take to the elevator. So in those days, it was only wheat and barley that you had a market for. So they had to go out and, they put lentils in 25-pound bags and drove around the state to the 4 natural food stores. Very quickly found customers, but, these are crops that you plant on 1,000-acre scales, so they needed more customers than that. So they started a business. They sort of learned as they went along. There's lots of hilarious stories about it, but they figured out crowdfunding, basically, in the days before the internet, and they figured out that what they were doing was important to people beyond the farm community, that what they were trying to do was create a healthy food system, and that there were people out there who cared about that for various reasons, whether they were environmentalists or cared about the local economy or wanted to have healthy food. And so they recognized that they needed to get those people involved as sort of stakeholders. So they now have sort of formal slow money investors who would identify themselves that way. At the beginning, they had that in practice, really. They had people who were not farmers who became shareholders by, putting in $1,000 early on to this business because they believed in those other values that were part of the larger food system. So they're now, I think about $1 million business. There are something like 20 family farmers who do the legume phase of their rotation through Timeless Natural Food. So Timeless Natural Food exists as an entity to market that phase of the rotation because it's easy to find markets for your grain. And there are other markets for oilseed crops, other aspects of this biodiversity. But the purpose of this business is to make sure farmers have a market for this key piece of the rotation that's putting that nitrogen back in the soil.
Oh, that's fabulous. And for people listening, and this is two words that we're hearing a lot of these days, the food system. Can you give us your definition of a food system? Someone asked me the other day, because we just did a food action plan in my community, and someone said, well, what is the food system? I don't understand. And so do you have any words you'd like to share with listeners about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think, in the most basic terms, the food system comprises consumption, distribution, marketing, production. So it's sort of putting all the sectors together that we used to think about separately, and that sometimes are geographically separated, and trying to think about them holistically so that, for example, when you think about health, you don't just focus on a nutrition facts label and telling people what to eat or not to eat, but you actually think about whether the incentives that we have in our production systems serve, once you get to the consumption step, the health of people. So we actually have people now in the health professions. Daphne Miller is a terrific example, physician in San Francisco, wrote this great book called Pharmacology, who are getting involved in policy about production because they understand that that affects health. And then on the other side, also, you have consumers who are thinking about what food choices they make, not just based on health, but also on what it means for farmers. And I think community-supported agriculture is a great example of that, where consumers say to their farmer, I'm going to pay you at the beginning of the season, and then you give me a box every week that represents the crops that make sense for you to grow. So I'm going to shift my diet so that it supports the ecology of your farming system.
In your opinion, Liz, how is the current food system in the U.S., at least, designed to benefit more of big food rather than smaller farmers?
Well, I think in a number of ways, I think we have current policies that really benefit big food over small family farmers. For example, sort of failure to properly enforce antitrust protections has led to massive conglomerates that have incredibly large market shares in things like seeds, in meat processing, in retail, which allow them, just really an unfair advantage over anybody who would try to have, say a small regional meat processing facility, or anybody who's tried to run a mom and pop grocery store knows how difficult it is to compete with those. So we definitely have current policies, and then we also have the legacies of old policies. So, policy has improved, I think, in this arena in the last 20 years in some areas, but we still have the advantages that those systems had going way back. So you think about all the research and development money that was spent, public money, taxpayer money in the 30s and 40s on developing hybrid seed systems that were connected to agricultural chemicals. The huge military-industrial complex in the 40s and 50s that, converted wartime technology to peacetime agricultural technologies. All of that is a subsidy to that whole way of doing agriculture. And if you compare that to the amount of money that's been invested in, for example, looking at which cover crops make sense in a particular farming system, anything in the agroecological arena, I've done a little bit of research with some colleagues on this, and it's just amazing. It's just amazing the disparity in public investment between those two systems.
So interesting. And another, and this is kind of not off topic, but I would love to get you to explain this to listeners because I never really thought about it. It was in your book, and it was the land sparing strategy. and that divide. If you could just speak a bit about that term to our listeners today.
Yeah, so this is a debate from conservation biology about essentially what do we do to make sure that we can conserve natural resources and wild biodiversity and also make sure that everybody in the world has enough to eat. So the sort of first theory that was most influential at the beginning of this debate was land sparing, which was the idea that we're going to take some land and protect it in parks. So we would know this as national parks in the U.S., but there's many different kinds of structures and governmental authorities that set aside land that people are not going to use for any productive purpose. There will be no agriculture there. And then on other pieces of land, we are going to farm them as intensively as possible to create the highest yields we can with absolutely no consideration for biodiversity or pollinator habitat or anything ecological. So we'll have some areas for intensive farming, other areas where we protect them for wildlife. So this theory led to on-the-ground policy. This theory has been very thoroughly tested. And what happened was these areas of intensive agricultural production did not tend to stay limited. The theory said, well, they're going to have such high yields that they won't need to expand. But they did expand. Why did they expand? Well, of course they expanded. If you understand anything about political economy, people were making money. But also over time, those yields declined. They were mining their natural resources, mining the natural resource base. And you do that 10 or 20 years, the yields decline. If you're not putting soil organic matter back, if you're not thinking about watersheds. And of course, agriculture is based on ecological processes. So a competing theory started to say, no, it's not land sparing. We don't need to spare some land for nature and then use some really intensively for agriculture. What we need is land sharing. So they started to look at traditional agricultural systems in which people produced food. A great example is in Central America. So coffee systems are now taking advantage of this idea that you can have a rainforest that is relatively intact, and you can plant coffee plants in that rainforest, and they can be productive, and you can get a crop, but you don't disrupt. Of course, anytime you engage in an ecosystem, you change it, but you don't prevent that ecosystem from fulfilling its ecosystem services. And that's good for your crop because your crop depends on those ecosystem services, and it allows for this sharing between biodiversity and basic regeneration of life support systems of the planet and agricultural production. So that's the basic theory of all organic farming. Organic farming that goes beyond just the organic label that really epitomizes the philosophy is that you're doing both things at once, conservation and agriculture together. And when you start to think about it, it's the only thing that makes any sense because agriculture and all forms of ecology, they all depend on those same basic life support services. So the idea that you would think about them separately, that we think of nature and farms as two different things is, just sort of a problem with Euro-American culture and like vast misunderstanding of what's going on in the world.
Do you think we're in the middle of a major shift toward the more integrative approach to agriculture?
We have to be. So I'll say yes, because I'm hopeful. I think it's just a question of what the driver is. If we get proactive about this, which is absolutely the way to do it, I think if we get proactive about it, then we're able to set up these systems in ways that are more democratic and good and healthy, and transitions can be pursued in a way that really takes account of everybody's livelihoods. Otherwise, we're going to end up making these changes because we're forced into it, and that's really going to challenge humanity. 100 years from now, 200 years from now, with the consequences of climate change. So I'm just so grateful to everybody who takes this as a proactive challenge to try to figure out how to transition all of our systems, our energy systems, our food systems, before we get to the point that it's an emergency.
And I think too, the trend, and especially I've done a lot of reading on millennial generation and that consumer transparency of really wanting to know the story behind the food and wanting to know, I think that, who grew this and how did they grow it and how did it affect the land around it. I think that's really helping shape this, at least in the U.S.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I'm teaching first-year students at Stanford right now in a class called Food Talks. And, just ask them all to do these research presentations. And we just had the first ones this morning. We'll have more on Wednesday. And it's clear that this isn't the first time they thought about those kinds of things. They did some more in-depth research for class, but it's not an unfamiliar thing to think about where their food came from or the story behind it. I think you're right that it's something their generation is embracing.
And so after writing your book, Lentil Underground, you said this was one of the questions that you were trying to find the answer to. Is it possible, do you believe it's possible to feed the world without destroying it?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I don't think that there's anything inherently destructive about agriculture. And, there's a healthy debate about that for sure. But I just see so many examples of ways in which humans can participate in an ecosystem without necessarily being a consumer. We have this paradigm that people use nature as if we weren't part of nature. And I think it's just a matter of relearning and getting in touch with what it means to be part of an ecological system in a way that we have roles that include regeneration, that there's something we have to offer ecologically on this planet, that we're not just takers. And so that's what I love so much about this story of the Lentil Underground, is that it's about giving back. Ultimately, it's about giving back, sharing, being part of a community that is synergistic, that is collaborative. And that's just such a powerful paradigm beyond farming, beyond the food system, I think, of a responsible way to conduct our lives as people in this world.
I know. And in the book, I believe it was in the book that you said this is really a book about community and, agriculture as well. But the community was really one of the most important thing.
Absolutely. And, agriculture is a vehicle to community. I think when you talk to this group of farmers, you'll hear all these interesting specific things about biodiverse farm systems, but it all tends to come back to this idea of community, whether it's ecological community or human community, usually a mix of the two. But sort of, being a citizen of the soil, and then also reconnecting with the farmers on either side of them, which was something their grandparents did at a time when farms were smaller and access to supermarkets, there was no highway from many of these places. So you had to know your neighbors. I think, there again with millennials, we hear about them having iPhones and sort of not talking to people. But at the same time, look at them on Facebook and Twitter. They are interested in connection, even if they have some other means of it. And actually, some of the interfaces between ways people are reconnecting to rural areas and also using those technologies are pretty fascinating. That I think, are actually, instead of facilitating a sort of cultural homogeneity, are actually facilitating a lot of what social scientists would call translocalism, of people developing these really interesting, specific local solutions to, things like crop biodiversity and sharing them with each other as inspiration rather than as we're all going to use the same system.
Do you believe that do you think the Lentil Underground timeless natural foods, I believe it's called, model can be replicated elsewhere? And this could be one of the solutions that we have to these problems that are occurring as a result of big ag.
Yeah. I think at the level of these principles, it can and is replicated in other places. So, lentils aren't the keystone crop for every agro-ecosystem. They're really important in Montana and the Dakotas and eastern Washington and Oregon and southern Saskatchewan and, many of the other areas around the world that I mentioned. But other kinds of areas have other kinds of key crops and key rotations. But I think this model of a group of farmers getting together, figuring out what they need to do to fit ecologically into their place so that they can farm without chemicals, and then figuring out what they need to do to be able to earn a living doing what's ecologically appropriate and developing infrastructure, developing markets, and then other people in other parts of the food system, the consumers, the people who care about the local economy, the people who care about nutrition and the environmentalists, supporting all of that. Because these farmers who are doing this are producing public goods for all of us when they take care of the watershed and when they mitigate climate change. So there has to be some mechanism for us to repay that value in a sense. So at the largest scale, I think this has to happen through policy. So most of the Lentil Underground is a story about people in a community figuring it out at that scale. And they've done an amazing job of figuring that out. But in order for this to scale up, you really need to have national level, international level policies shift so that, how about we give farmers subsidies for cover crops rather than, historically when people were paid just for planting particular staple crops. There's a lot of interesting innovation, I think, around these kinds of policy mechanisms, but that ultimately, I think, is what we need to do is, as a society, decide what kinds of stewardship we want to reward and then reward it.
One thing that made me laugh in your book was, I think it was in the book or an article about you. I researched you so much, I'm getting confused. But I'm wondering if Dave Oien is looking for Lentil Underground recruits. I know that I think it was he that had the classified ad that was really cute and looking for farmers.
Yeah. In fact, I will meet some people at this year's annual Timeless Seeds Growers Gathering at the end of June who are new, who are in their first growing season with Timeless. So that's going to be really exciting for me. One of the farm tours actually is a place that I haven't been to. So there's all kinds of room, not just for new farmers, but also for new businesses. Since since Dave came back to his family farm, Montana Flour and Grain started also in the 80s, which is doing a similar thing for ancient grains, which are rotated with these legumes. The guy who started that has since started a business called the Oil Barn, which has a super interesting business model. They are growing safflower, and the first thing that they do with it is culinary, but then, and some of it is sold in bottles, but some of it is also sold to local restaurants, and then they pick up that oil and use it in tractors as a biofuel. And this is a crop from a different family than either grains or legumes, so it's also providing biodiversity in the rotation. So it's not just that there's more farmers getting involved, but there's also room for businesses in other steps of the food system. Local meat processing. Many of these systems rely on crop-livestock integration, so that's a big part of the puzzle too.
It's very hopeful and exciting.
Yes.
And so we're getting to the end of our time, and I'm just curious, when you set out to write this book, what surprised you the most in this journey of spending time with these farmers? And was there anything that really struck you as something that you didn't expect to find?
I think maybe the bigger surprise is that people like you still call me. Once I, decided, hey, I want to write a book for a general audience, and lentil's going to be in the title. As you might imagine, I had a difficult time convincing anybody in New York that this was a good idea. I did have, I should say, Michael Pollan is a fantastic mentor and helped me a lot and made that journey much smoother than it would have been otherwise. But still, I had a lot of literary agents say, I just don't think that the general public is going to be interested in this. Of course, we always believe that this will resonate in the story of community, but, the hardcover came out at the very beginning of 2015. I was delighted that they did a paperback at the beginning of this year. And, this is a pretty long cycle for a book to generate conversation. And I'm just thrilled about it. I love hearing about conversations that people have about this book and how it connects to the way they're changing their diets or things they're doing in their garden or things that are happening in their rural communities. I just get the coolest emails and pictures and, conversations with people. people. So that's maybe been the surprise, or the good surprise, is that this is resonant. These stories about community and how food connects us both to each other and the environment. This really is a movement that's happening in many ways all over the world, and I'm just delighted to be a little part of it.
Oh, that's so great. And where can people find your book and you?
Well, there's a website, lentilunderground.com. You can find the book just about everywhere. The paperback's gotten really good distribution, so head down to your independent local bookstore or your local library. That would be my recommendation. And yeah, jump on lentilunderground.com and tell me about your story and what you're doing in the food system.
Oh, and is there anything else you want to add to share with listeners today?
Well, you have to cook some lentils too, Try this in your kitchen.
I love them. I eat them all the time. They're so good. I know, and I'm so thrilled. It is the International Year of Pulses, and there's a lot of recipes online now and all sorts of ways to use lentils.
Yes, yeah. And the Timeless Food Facebook page is posting just about a recipe a day, so that's a good place to look.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Jill. My pleasure.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.